welcome very much to the PCB Data Safe Symposium. In this session, we will look into the cybersecurity and data privacy and discuss a few topics in the predictions and trends. But before we get started, let me take the floor first, and then we'll hand over the introductions to each of the teams. As you might see, today my role is that of a moderator, and based on the feedback of the team, we have put up some questions to animate actually the suggestions for today. So I suggest, Emmanouil, that you start off with introducing yourself quickly, and then we will pass the round to the other ones.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I would like to thank you for the kind invitation. I am Emmanouil Kafetzakis. I have a PhD on computer science, and I am leading 8Bell's research team. That is an SME that has many cybersecurity projects, among others. My background is on cybersecurity and on networks and telecommunications.
Good, interesting feedback. So good background actually to give some interesting expert answers for today. Atil, what's your role for today?
Hi everyone, thanks for the invite as well. I'm Atil. I live in Turkey, Istanbul. I'm actually the CTO of our software company, and also I have a training company as well. I've been a software engineer for over 10 years, and I'm also teaching cybersecurity and software engineering on online platforms in universities as well. I've taught more than 500,000 students so far, and I'm planning to continue to do so.
Good. The next on the row, Jeffrey, welcome. Introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. Yes, my name is Jeffrey Crump. I'm the principal consultant at Cybersecurity Training and Consulting. Sunny Arizona based. It's early here in the United States, but one of the lines of businesses that we have focuses on the defense industrial base and the global defense supply chain. And I spent a lot of time teaching students and organizations how to be prepared for a new DoD cybersecurity maturity model certification. So with that in mind, spent a lot of time in the DoD space and the supply chain. And so a key element of that, of course, is around protecting sensitive information. And so looking forward to collaborating with the panel here on that.
Good, thank you. And last but not least, Rajesh.
Hey, thanks everyone. This is Rajesh Laskary here. I'm the founder and CISO of Arden Consulting Singapore Private Limited. And I've been into IT and cybersecurity for almost 20 years now. My expertise is in governance, risk, compliance, and audit space. And I specialize in EPIC regulations regarding cybersecurity and data privacy. So with that, I'm really looking forward to a great panel discussion over here. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, as you see, we have got a very interesting international panel. So yeah, let's get started with one of the first questions. And yeah, I'm very interested in your personal point of view and your personal expectations and experiences in that sense. Jeffrey already mentioned cybersecurity and the new trends. So let's get started with that one, Jeffrey. If you work with cybersecurity and the things you're working with, the new legislations or frameworks, what's the most prominent thing that we should focus on the next few weeks, if not months?
Yeah, well, as we all know, it changes every day, right? Never know what our adversaries are going to do. Certainly, you know, what the DoD is concerned with is protecting this sensitive information that's being shared with the supply chain. They refer to it as controlled unclassified information. And because the supply chain is a global thing, they're very concerned about how information that comes from the government or, you know, is created by the government and then it's shared down with those contractor companies within that global defense supply chain. So, you know, certainly a U.S. type of a thing that they're putting out there to help protect this sensitive information. But because it is a global supply chain, there's obviously international ramifications and considerations and the implications of, okay, well, if the DoD is utilizing this guidance coming from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, well, you know, that's a set of controls to protect this information, but how does it affect, you know, the United States, and how does it affect, you know, downstream other countries and some of its key allies and partners across the world? That's a little bit more of a delicate balance to strike, especially when it comes to privacy and that information. So if the DoD says, hell, you know, we want to, you know, these contract companies within our defense supply chain to protect the information in this manner, well, that manner may not necessarily coincide with how a given contract supplier in an international locations privacy or, you know, protection of sensitive information. So when it comes to that, yes, we need to kind of get started, because we know a lot of those companies don't really have the appropriate controls in place. And so there's a lot of activity around that and a lot of pressure from the government to get organizations across this global supply chain to get moving and just, you know, get these controls in place. And then when you start throwing in, you know, some of these advanced technologies that I know are going to come up in the conversation around artificial intelligence, distributed ledger, quantum computing, it just makes things much more challenging. You know, if they're just trying to set this initial baseline, and yet the marker, as we all know, it continues to move and move and move. Yeah, boy, it's tough. So you just got to get started.
Do you think, let me put it that way, a lot of companies, including SMEs and smaller enterprises, think that cybersecurity is a matter of protecting yourself, although that many legislations, including GDPR, take account of suppliers in that sense. Do you think that we are shifting in the future to more focus on suppliers, both for cybersecurity as for data protection or privacy?
Well, I don't know that there's a shift, because we all feel like we've, you know, I think we would all agree that we've always had a shared responsibility, right? It's just now, and as we see with NIST and NIS, right, and NIS2 over in Europe, the accountability is being lifted up, right? So here, in, you know, with regard to the defense supply chain, what they're doing is you know, for those mid, you know, those ones that are kind of what we call level 2, level 3 types of organizations, it's requiring a third party or a government assessment of the organization's actual implementation of these controls. And there's a flow down element, which means that if I'm receiving this sensitive information, I'm giving it to somebody in my supply chain. Well, that person in the supply chain also has to be able to demonstrate an ability. So by moving from the trust to verify element, you know, in our cybersecurity adages, they're building accountability. And so accountability, absolutely. And we see that with NIST, where we're having, you know, to have executives sign on the dotted line or attest to some conformity. Yeah, we're not only is it, you know, a NIS2 thing, we're seeing the same thing here in the United States around that stuff as well.
Yeah, while Emmanouil and myself actually are working from the European Union inside on that one, how does that work, Atil, in Turkey? I mean, you're pretty close and heavily impacted with GDPR, very much doing a lot of business also in the European zone, obviously. How does that impact actually your life or the view from the Eastern European approach in that sense?
Yeah, obviously you're right. We are heavily affected by the GDPR compliance stuff. And even though each country has its own procedures and negotiations, we have to comply with the GDPR because we are trading daily. And what we see over here is that we don't have the current year's result, I think, but last year I have seen that in 1 year, the GDPR violations increased by more than 100% in Europe, not only in Turkey, but across Europe. And of course, the fines came with it increased more than 100% as well. So what we see over here is that GDPR is trying to keep the leash a little bit tighter. So they are going to make things a little bit hard for everyone. However, it's not a bad thing. I'm not talking about they're doing it wrong, but they are doing it to create a more safer environment for us. But it comes with the challenges, of course, because, for example, let's focus on trends a little bit. As you might know, as you already know, after pandemic, working remote has been like a very stable thing for us. We are all working remote one day or another, and it will stay like that. But it creates many kind of threats in both ways. So it's kind of a double-edged sword for the employers, because if you have more than 1,000 employees, if you let it loose, they're working remotely. If anybody outside of cybersecurity team gets hacked or gets their data leaked, it affects the whole company. So you have to have like regular adjustments and monitoring systems in order to control that. But you shouldn't have too much, because it's the employees' data eventually, and you shouldn't collect that kind of thing as well. So you need to find a balance. That's just one example that these kind of things create for us. But I think the answer to that is to invest more in the education or training of the people working outside of the cybersecurity within all the companies. I've seen like a very interesting number. 85% of the people in a recent survey said that we are regularly bypassing cybersecurity trainings in order to meet the business demands. So only maybe 25% of the people actually pay attention to those kind of things, and God knows how many of them actually learn this stuff. So there is a huge thing going on over there. You have to invest more in the employee trainings in order to increase your compliance rate in the GDPR and everything as well. Not only, I'm not talking about only the contracts that you do to increase your cybersecurity overall, but also train your people to have that kind of link, that everything holding together.
Rajesh, quick question on that one. While Atil is pointing out on the awareness and training, what will change, or what do you predict on the level of awareness and training? Meaning, we had all had globally quite a busy time during COVID, people working at home, as Atil mentioned correctly. Will that change, or what do you think that awareness will go to for the next weeks, if not months, if not years?
Yeah, I mean, very interesting topic. And, I was just reading it today morning while preparing, and I got to know that, interestingly, there was a survey done from World Economic Forum, and they said that first thing that they predict is by 2030, passwords are nearly going to be obsolete. And most important part of this was that cybersecurity is going to be a widely taught subject in primary schools. So that's quite a positive move towards strengthening the human defense. So I'm quite hopeful from that perspective that threats, obviously, they will always be there. But with increased awareness and global participation and awareness around it, we'll be in a better shape to safeguard our organizations or our individuals, for that matter.
Yeah, you touched an interesting point on the passwords. Do you think that if we get rid of password, or at least build the new foundations on multi-factor authentication, will it diminish or will it minimize cybersecurity attacks?
Yeah, I think that's our goal always. We are always, cybersecurity professionals are always there to minimize the risks, right? If not eliminate that. So that's the basic principle. So I think, it is going to be very important to realize that irrespective of whether you go with passwords, because passwords have protected, at least tried to protect us for so many years. So going passwordless with some advanced technologies or implementations probably will help. But at the same time, I think the more focus nowadays is towards implementation of zero trust architecture and zero trust principles. So you basically validate at every step, verify every resource request or any subject. So I think with a combination of technologies, yes, certainly that's going to be helpful.
Yeah, I know that there are some new things popping up also, Jeffrey, in the NIST guidance and frameworks. They're working very hard to stay up to date. How do they take into account, for example, artificial intelligence? Do you think that we're there yet, or how can we use artificial intelligence, or what do you think that will happen with artificial intelligence? And again, we probably don't know for the next months, if not years, but what's your view actually on artificial intelligence, certainly on cybersecurity and data protection, both on the offense and the defense side, right? So
yeah, it's obviously a constantly evolving kind of a thing. Now the good news is NIST does a really good job of staying ahead of the curve. So we know that, we had ISO came out recently, I think it was in February, with some guidance around, risk management in the AI context. But it was actually in January, just a month prior to that, where NIST came out with an AI risk management framework. And so, this RMF, and RMF from is a term that describes a risk management framework. That's something that's very common. It's implemented within the U.S. Department of Defense, a federal government type of a thing, right? So they've built out on that this AI RMF, and what's nice about what NIST does is what they put out there. Yes, they are a Department of Commerce. Yes, they are, creating things predominantly focused for the U.S. government, but there's nothing, stopping private industry to adopting this. And when they put out this RMF, it was certainly expected that, industry itself would be able to kind of take advantage of this risk management framework. So, and I would expect that, we're going to see some commonality across the ISO and the RMF, and because all of these groups I think are really collaborating. For example, for this RMF, they spent 18 months, generating this thing, and they worked with, something like 240 different organizations across private industry and academia and civil society and governments, and on an international basis. So that's what I'm really encouraged, is that, yeah, hey, we're already, just this year, we've seen two major pieces of regulatory governance types of things come out, and they are keeping in mind an international, perspective on this. So that's a great thing.
Yeah, you mentioned the last 18 months. I mean, if you look back, certainly on ChatGPT and whatever I liked to it. I mean, if you look back for 18 months, just give and take 2 years, it's clearly that we are moving extremely fast in that sense. How do you think that legislation, or maybe even a bit more optimistic, that standards or frameworks can keep up with that move?
Yeah, it's tough. So the RMF itself, so the strategy that they're taking is that for this, the general high level kind of RMF is something, and this is pretty standard, that would be updated on a 2 to 3 year kind of a cycle. But what they've done, because of that point exactly, Peter, is they have a playbook, an AI playbook, and that playbook is expected to be updated on a much more frequent basis to keep pace with all of the changes in the evolution of the AI, kind of a landscape that we've got.
How do you see AI, Emmanouil, on your side? I mean, yeah, you're looking into with a special view on that one. Is from a research perspective of what you are doing, how important is AI?
Yes, AI is a hot topic nowadays. It's a trend. However, it has pros and cons. First of all, you need a lot of data set that are not biased. So you have to train the models, and at the end, to these solutions to migrate or respond to an incident. So in all cases, at least in Europe, we have to have humans in the loop, because we don't know if AI response is the proper one, because AI up to now it have been considered the solutions as a black box, are not explainable. In the input you put the data, and the output you have the response, but you cannot explain how you reach to this response. And there is also always the fear to overfit the model on the data sets. So humans have to be in place, and these tools help humans to process large data or trigger alarms. However, we expect that specific attacks will appear targeting to AI models, adversarial AI attacks, that they modify slightly the attack to not be understood by humans in order to force AI models to collapse. But in general, we think that easy and repeatable tasks can be approached by AI models to leave humans the more tricky situations and most challenging tasks. But humans have to be there. This is my point of view.
Yeah, one of the other things, and we're focusing, and also you see it popping up a bit more in the standards, Rajesh, in that sense, what about IoT? I mean, we discuss AI, and it's popping up actually on multiple layers of cybersecurity and even data protection. We'll come back to that one probably later on, but actually the same question applies to IoT, so the Internet of Things or industrial control systems, production systems. We are more relying on it. How do you think that the future trends or cybersecurity and data protection will play a role in IoT?
Yeah, I think very true, as Emmanouil just mentioned, right? The threat landscape is undoubtedly it's going to evolve, and it is going to be quite diversified in that sense. And as we continue to digitize and interconnect, I think that AI-driven threats are certainly going to increase multifold, especially when you talk about IoTs and OT devices. Your more reliance is on cloud. And that's where, it is not just the device level security or endpoint level security. You also have to talk about securing the overall overarching infrastructure, including the cloud. And when you talk about cloud, obviously the shared, as Jeffrey just pointed it out, right? The shared responsibility model makes it even more difficult to know and assess where the data is residing. So for example, data sovereignty related issues may pop up. And similarly, when you talk about increased attack on IoT and OT devices because of AI, because the biggest challenge which IoT and OT devices are a lack of standardization, because there are millions of manufacturer and promoter of these devices. So it is going to be challenging. And recently I read it in a report, I think it was from Gartner, that they said that adversaries will be successful in weaponizing OT environments and to be able to cause human casualties by maybe year 2025 or so. So that's a dangerous perspective that I see from OT security point of view.
Yeah, one typical situation for our team more specifically is these production environments or control technical environments typically survive 10, 15, 20 years, whatever, which we are actually from the cybersecurity or data protection perspective slightly different. How do you see the impact of that actually in the lifetime of the products and responsibility to it versus cybersecurity?
So maybe if you can repeat your question once again.
In OT and IoT and SCADA systems, so the industrial control systems, they usually tend to keep it as much as stable for 10 even to 20 years, and that's not what we do within the typical internet security and cloud security. How do you see actually that evolving or coming up for the next years?
So I think biggest change that I see happening nowadays is, people have at least started talking about IoT and OT security sincerely and seriously. And that was, I think, missing a few years back. But now it is quite stringent. In fact, more and more regulations and, compliance related risks are being evaluated in OT space specifically. So I think it will be interesting to see how data security and OT security go in hand in hand.
Okay, thanks. And another question, and referring a bit to the upcoming legislation, so the NIS2 legislation, which is taking account of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. One of the topics that actually is highlighted next to accountability or supply chain, which Jeffrey already discussed a bit, but the new legislation is focusing on accountability of the company leaders, the company management team, to make them accountable for failure of implementing security. Jeffrey, in that sense, how is the US looked at that one? Does it match up with the European view in the future, making company owners, directors more accountable in that sense? What is your opinion on that sense for the future?
Yeah, it's I would imagine there'll be some evolution of that. The way things are really kind of structured when it comes to the DoD supply chain, and I had made mention of this new CMMC thing, and depending upon the kind of information that an organization handles, so federal contract information or FCI, well, there's a smaller number of controls and requirements around that. You can self-assess and do that kind of thing. But when you move into the controlled unclassified information, and then well, you have to have this independent assessment that occurs there. And part of the legal regulatory element of there is something called the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement 252.204-7012. Okay, this 7012 thing, what it does is it outlines, well, what are the safeguarding controls that are required to kind of be in place to protect it. But the second half of that is around the incident reporting. And so there are requirements that an organization that is doing business with the DoD has a capability, and we are doing assessments, and as part of those assessments we have these requirements for the independent assessment, and so there's accountability there. But there's nothing that says, well, if you don't do this, well, how do we know when you don't do it? Well, if we come in and we do an assessment and everything looks great at that point in time, but then 6 months later something happens and you're not able to kind of execute. Well, the idea is that the control bodies themselves, the rinse repeat cycle, would ensure that those kinds of capabilities continue to exist. And if you have any, if you determine you're not doing those things, well, then there could be some accountability there. Or if if you've used that conformity assessment to win some business, well, you might find that if you're not able to actually do some of these things, you might lose a certification, right? Or if you get like an interim type of a certification and you've got some gaps, and you get to maybe you win some business while you're on this interim type of a certification, and then you get to the end and you haven't implemented these controls, you can lose the business. So there's accountability to some degree kind of built into the business cycle, but there's also built into the control body as well as the legal regulatory kind of framework. We have something called the False Claims Act. If an organization is attesting that they're doing certain things and come to find out that they're not doing those things, then there can certainly be some accountability on that front. But as part of this CMMC thing, they get this third-party assessment that's typically good. That's going to be good for 3 years, but that's a long time, right? When it comes to the world we live in. So to completely rely on a 3-year cycle for, you know, some validation that they're conforming, probably not. So the CMMC is going through some regulatory rulemaking process right now. And what we would expect to kind of see coming out of that is, even though an organization might have had this third-party assessment, there's still going to be a need for an annual executive attestation that says, hey, we're still doing this stuff, we're still doing this stuff, we're still doing this stuff. So there is right, that didn't exist before. So that's kind of being built in now, or expected to be built in as part of that rulemaking process. So that evolution is already beginning to kind of materialize.
Emmanouil, is that something that you see happening also on the European side? Do you think that certification will increase, or the need for certification will increase in the future?
Yes, for sure, the need for certification will be increased in the future. However, cybersecurity does not come without cost. We have to consider the cost of all these controls, and then to propose a solution to everybody that can afford. Imagine that even for SMEs that are going to be certified for ISO to 27501, there are more than 100 controls in 14 different control areas. This is the minimum that a European SME has to take care. So I think that the fundamentals of cybersecurity are always there, that for each case separately, we have to locate the vulnerabilities, to identify the assets, the potential threats, the risk, and then propose the proper controls, and not have one solution for all, because this will become very expensive, and the potential customers will not be possible to purchase or pay for this.
Yeah, the certification right now is voluntary, meaning that ISO is not mandatory in that sense. It gives a lot of trust, but Atil, one of the things that currently is missing in this entire story is ethical guidelines. All that Rajesh already mentioned into that one, we need to take it into account for artificial intelligence and how data is being used. What do you think about the future of ethical guidelines? Of course, for example, in Europe, there will be an Artificial Intelligence Act trying to find out, or trying to get some guidelines on that one. What do you think about ethical guidelines in the future?
Yeah, the artificial intelligence is like one of the most important things that we have to focus on, and we have to consider, not only in cybersecurity, but in overall all the technology, I think, for the following years. And we already see a lot of examples and funny stories around the world. Maybe you have seen the lawyer who actually has used ChatGPT to create his case, and ChatGPT unfortunately made up some previous cases that never existed, and it only got into in front of the judge and then came out, and it didn't do good for the lawyer. So you have to, as Emmanouil suggested, you have to bring in the human possibility or human interaction in here as well, and you have to create guidelines for that. Thank God that many of the companies, leading companies in this area, including the OpenAI and other ones, are actually working on that. So maybe you're trying to follow along with their statements and stuff. So they're even saying that we have to take it slow before it may become harmful to us. And we have to create very concise and very to the point guidelines where we can use the ChatGPT, where we can use the generative AI, where we can take advantage of the stuff, and where we can actually leave them off. It's related with the academics, it's related with the work environment, it's related with the cybersecurity and all the stuff. And I think the faster the countries or the policymakers adjust to this, the much better it will be. Because as you suggested, some of the guidelines gets updated maybe in 10 years or 5 years or 12 years. So it has to be fast. It has to be much faster than that in order not to create a harmful environment for us.
One of the things I usually get as a feedback from companies is, yeah, right, we need to be faster, but how do we follow up on these legislations? What is prediction in that level on being compliant in the future with the cybersecurity? Will it be easier to do so? Will it be default? What do you think on the speed of security? Maybe that's a question for you, Jeffrey. Is keeping up with the speed of cybersecurity. What's your prediction in that sense for the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's it's going to be tough, but I think we're seeing excuse me, an increase in collaboration. So I know Emmanouil said something about this single standard, but boy oh boy, and that's going to be really kind of impossible to kind of pull off, really, especially when you come to something like AI and what is ethical? Well, depends on what is the purpose of this AI mechanism, right? It's if we're using it in a civil type of an environment versus a warfighting environment, well, the principles of ethics can be very different, right? The boundaries, we've got degrees of degrees that come into play for that. And so coming to some common ground, boy, that's always a challenge, right? Even if we kind of go in, we got a business problem, and the last thing we want to do is group think, but somehow we have to get to a consensus. Well, even with the consensus, somebody's winning some, somebody's losing some. And if we're gonna we want to move in that direction, but boy oh boy, is that going to be a challenging kind of a feat for the US to agree with Europe, to agree with different, not just continents, but the countries and and then the individuals within those. It's just a very difficult type of thing, but it's obviously encouraging to see work towards that, but it's going to be I think a long evolutionary process for
one of the strong things in that sense, what the NIST, the NIST has been pushing very much is knowledge sharing, and so the last few years also ENISA, which is more or less the counterpart actually from the cybersecurity government agency also in Europe, has been pushing ISAC, so Internet of Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. Do you think that's what's is the trend in that sense? Is knowledge sharing becoming more important, or what do you think about that one?
Yeah, it's so one of the great things is I spent some time doing some of this stuff. The companies are always reluctant to want to share this stuff, right? Because there's a concern that, hey, what I'm sharing about what's happening during this incident, I might get exposed, or somebody's going to reveal a vulnerability, right? So it was always concerned about sharing, but everybody wants to benefit from the sharing. And so
with the mistakes the other makes,
that's something we've been struggling for quite some time. With regard to the DoD in particular kind of a thing, and the defense industrial base, they've had a program in place to really kind of have this intel sharing, because we do have the elements of, as I mentioned, that DFAR 7012 that has that requirement for incident reporting. So the data is coming in, right? It's coming in. It's not coming through more of a collaborative, ISAC kind of a model, kind of a thing. We need it. It's just, how do we convince the organizations to give up the information so that we can jointly benefit from that? And then, we're always going to be concerned about, well, what am I sharing? How much can I share? Because, if we're coming from an organization that's, you know, in the EU and they're bound by GDPR, and then, you know, and trying to share that to the US versus somebody in the US that's trying to share it with a partner in the EU or somewhere else in the world, we have to worry about this balance of, well, what can I share? How much of that? And who's going to kind of regulate what kind of comes and goes across that transmission kind of a thing? And we've seen even that, you know, come up recently with regard to some of the legal stuff. And, you know, this kind of this, you know, backing off of the privacy shield, and, you know, going back to reliance upon contracts. Yeah, that's because it's a very detailed kind of a challenge, and to try and solve for that holistically, I think is going to be quite a bit.
How do you think that from an APAC side, Rajesh, is information sharing important of how, because actually the information sharing, certainly from NISA, from a European point of view, is landing more and more in the legislations. How does it look like from India or from the APAC side, a bit more globally speaking in that sense? I mean, is it similar, or what do you think it will happen in the next few years for APAC and information sharing?
I think from you know, reporting perspective, Singapore is doing phenomenal in that sense, I would say. I mean, I'll give you some examples. So if let's say it's coming down to your CII, your critical information infrastructure, it is by regulations. I mean, you are supposed to report to authorities within a certain amount of time, let's say within 4 hours or 3 hours. And if you don't do it, the penalties are like going to be in millions. So that's where I think it is going to be a balance between what organizations by themselves can do it and how much authorities can, you know, press them to do something. So it is a fine balance between both. And when it comes to the AI related privacy and data security threats, as Jeffrey just mentioned, I think it's going to be a balance between education or awareness, employee awareness, as well as the governance part. So when it comes to governance, you decide what you can share, what you can't share, how you can share, whom you can share with your AI models. On the parallel, you implement educational awareness programs, because that's an area where technical controls will not help you much, because your employees have to be educated what to share, what not to share. And that's where I think this shift is taking place. So you just see 5 years, 6 years back, cybersecurity was purely seen as like cybersecurity professionals' job responsibilities. Today, you look at any organizations, developers, testers, business analysts, C-level executive, everybody is being taught about fundamentals of cybersecurity. So I think that's a good shift to which we see nowadays.
Yeah,
Jeffrey? Yeah.
Rajesh, so yeah, it could be a very simplistic example, okay, but to your point, right? This move to this commonality, this understanding, we all kind of agree, hey, we're not supposed to, an AI model shouldn't share certain kinds of information, right? So, you know, we've implemented on, you know, one of our sites a third-party solution, and it's kind of a presentation layer on top of ChatGPT-4, right? But you can program it with your own library of, right? You can build that in there, and so because it's on a business website, you know, we're trying to get in there, hey, here's contact information, here's phone numbers, and here's stuff like that, right? So when somebody's on there and it says, hey, what's your contact information, right? It's going to come back. Well, right now it's very reluctant, you know, even it's very simplistic. It goes, hey, hey, you're asking for a phone number, I can't give you a phone number, right? It's like, well, hold on a second, right? The context here is that we're in a business environment, and I do want you to share the phone number, right? So it's like, right. So, but you know, so it's good. So if you know, if you ask this thing, hey, what's your phone number, right? It says, no, I can't share that with you. But if you ask it in a different manner, so what is the contact information for this, you know, this company that I'm on? Well, then it'll spit it out to you, right? So
yeah, it's interesting mention, Jeffrey, and I'm looking into yeah, a few questions coming from the audience, and I think I might plug in one of them here. The question is how to control sensitive data introduced by a company into ChatGPT. I mean, obviously we had quite some important recent data leaks in that sense that it's pretty much plugging in also into your feedback and into providing that sensitivity. What do you think we need to do in the future to make ChatGPT? I almost said rock solid, but it's quite a challenge. What do you think actually we should do to make that GDPR or data protective safe? Any idea, Jeffrey?
Yeah. Well, you know, hey, we've got technical controls, administrative controls, physical controls, right? So there's only, you know, if we're talking Chat GPT, you know, hey, who's training that thing? You know, we don't know. They're training, they're throwing all kinds of stuff at it, right? Obviously, we would want to have some policies in place for our organization that says, hey, don't use that thing for those kinds of questions, right? Maybe what we do, and kind of like what, you know, this evolution of the blockchain kind of a thing, is let's do a private instance of this thing, right? And then that way we're within a confined space. We've got some control here, right? So if I want to go in and say, you know, ask a question about a customer, I'm within a confined data set, right? I don't want to go off and, you know, kind of feed it and give that, you know, that monster any kind of sensitive information. But we obviously have to tell people not to do that. And then where it's going to be more of a challenge is what do we do? How do we identify when we have those incidents, right? So stuff starts to show up, you know, in Chat GPT, you know, that's sensitive or, you know, to our company. And it's like, well, how'd they get there? Yeah, I don't know that those folks participate in it.
It's pretty impossible to put in some, let's for example, an application firewall into the flow of data to the Chat GPT. It's quite a challenge in that sense. Yeah, and another question, maybe for you, Emmanouil. Do you think the question here, and I can imagine that actually it's coming from some of our UK spectators or the people watching it. What do you think that the new bills actually in the UK and the data protection bills and the digital information bills is going through Parliament? How will it impact on Europe and beyond? And let me extend to that one. Also in Europe, there's quite some legislation coming up on data governance, so it's pretty much plugging into the previous questions. How are we going to manage the data in the future? What's your opinion in that sense, and how to manage the data, Emmanouil?
I'm not sure if I can answer this question because it is a bit legal for me, but what I would like to say is that I think that the internet as we know today will be modified. One internet best effort for everybody and some more secure networks and data storages for critical domains. Europe, I suppose also UK, is working on governmental communications that will be quantum based. So later on, apart from governments, the banking, the finance sector will join, and we slowly will build a critical infrastructure. And I suppose the legislation has to catch up with this trend. So I imagine one internet for everybody, and in parallel something critical. A critical network, let's say, secured by quantum cryptography and zero trust policies.
One of the other questions, and this one is for the entire group, again, a bit of a legal question, although quite interesting, is what do you think about the new and the recent China privacy law and It's also mentioning in the question and the relation to the sanctions, and it says that actually that if you don't comply, it has even the rights to close your business. It's a pretty different approach from GDPR, and certainly within the US approach in that sense. What do you think about the geographic or geopolitical stuff actually in that sense, Rajesh? Any insights on that one?
Yeah, I think it is, I would say, it is yet to be seen how this particular legislation that we are talking about will impact the businesses. But it is what is interesting to note here is that governments are taking it to next level when it comes to data privacy, irrespective of which country the government belongs to. But and this particular development, it is not just the China. You're seeing it happening everywhere. Like even in Singapore, we have our own Personal Data Protection Act. In India, there are new laws being introduced when it comes to data privacy laws. So only the time will tell what level of impact these type of legislations will have. But yes, I think this is a step that probably needs some more time to be evaluated, in my opinion.
Atil, I think, yeah, just to continue on that one, and obviously I think you had some quite interesting times also in Turkey. There's in the US something, yeah, quite interesting popping up because the elections are freshly started. Candidates are putting themselves up as a president candidate in that sense. How do you think, from your side, Atil, that the politics or the geopolitics is influencing, and even during the current COVID times, we've seen a lot of these kind of questions during COVID popping up. What is your point on that one, on the geopolitics, Atil, for the next years?
Yeah, I have to agree with Rajesh over here, because we see this as a trend. Every country is trying to impose more stricter rules across cybersecurity compliance. Of course, in the case of China, it's always, they're taking these things very seriously. The question was about China, so I'm talking about it because, aside from the social or the cybersecurity, there are some kind of social media detox camps over here. So they say that if you're obsessed with social media, if you're using it too much, you have to go into a detox camp and you have to stay away from the internet for like one or a couple of weeks, and you can come back and you're refreshed. So they're taking this thing seriously. So no wonder they're trying to or planning to close the companies that don't comply with this act. Even though in the other regions of the world, including the Europe, we don't expect to see that much of strict policies. It will get tougher, obviously. So companies need to keep things, hold their things together and try to adapt these things more quickly with heavy investment on this stuff.
It's an interesting remark, Atil, because actually it ties up actually with the last question we want to present you for today. The question is, and I'll point it to you, Jeffrey, in that one. Will there be a no-go zone for AI? Let me explain. The question says, should we block AI for using certain data, or yeah, for example, if certain data is being used by AI, it should be considered by default as a data breach. Should we have a no-go zone for AI?
Yeah, but that's kind of what we were talking about before, right? It's these degrees of use cases, and obviously, from a Department of Defense, I mean, I don't represent the DoD, but from a defense sector type of a thing, the use case model there is very kind of different than it is for decisioning for mortgages, right? Kind of a thing. Yeah, I don't know that we can get to that. Maybe in a given context, there could maybe be some degrees of control that could be, kind of agreed upon there, but that maybe a bit more easily achieved, you know, in a regular business type of environments versus in a warfighting type of an application kind of a thing. Yeah, I can tell you, I was at a space conference deal with space, and there you guys have you've probably seen the robotic dogs, right? So I can and so I was standing around the dog, and the operator said, you want me to put this thing in autonomous mode? I was thinking, well, no, it's like, you got to be careful just reaching out, to a real dog, because you don't know if they're going to bite you. And here, I want to turn over, this robotic animal to, its own mindset. Yeah, boy, to your point, I hope there are some boundaries around, what that thing can and can't do. But given its application, right, if it's patrolling a beach, that's one thing. But if it's acting as a companion robot dog, well, that's a totally different use case, right?
Yeah.
And the rules of the road for that are very different.
Yeah, so that comes back a bit to the ethical guidelines again. So yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think that pretty much concludes the session of today. So we started at 5 o'clock. Thanks a lot for your valuable insights, gentlemen. So looking forward to meet you again. So yeah, that's it. I think we had the most of the questions answered in that sense. So thank you for your insights, and talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.